more, of course, damaged physically and psychologically by the experience. An aspect of the war, I have to say, which I think we underplay a great deal. Casualties are not just those who end up dead on the battlefield. There are many other kinds of casualty that one can count in the Second World War. Even more extraordinary, most of the combatant powers, except the United States, devoted around about 2/3 of their GNP to the waging of war. That's an extraordinary figure. You think of the fuss people make now about 1% of GNP here and there. To think of countries willing for 5 or 6 years to devote up to 2/3 of their GNP to the waging of war. And then we need to remember, of course, the civilian cost. The tens of millions dispossessed, deported, whose wealth and income was squandered, people who starved to death or died of mass epidemics, those who died under the bombing, and those, of course, who were the victims of violent racism. What an extraordinary conflict it was. So how do we approach it if our job is to write a history of the Second World War? Well, I would say that the recent tendency in much of the historiography has been to what I call simplification or reductive narratives of the war. You can get reductive narratives of a number of different kinds. One, of course, is that the war and everything associated with it in the end derives from Hitler. Hitler is our central reference point if we want to understand why war happened and the course of the war. Well, whatever one thinks about the role of great individuals in history, this is clearly an inadequate explanation, not only because it's intensely Eurocentric. And then there are histories of the war simply as military conflict, with a growing tendency really to treat this rather like the Premier League, rating states for their capacity to wage war effectively, producing league tables of performance, which alter over time as people find good things to say about the Italians or good things to say about the British Army. And then there is war as a simple ideological battlefield. This is perhaps the most persistent, and one can understand it, persistent reductive narrative, that this is in fact a war of good versus evil. Complicated in a way, of course, because you have to sidestep the fact that Britain and the United States were fighting side by side with the Soviet Union, and since 1990, of course, we now have no illusions about the nature of the Soviet system during the wartime period. Now, all of these are what we might regard as tidy answers. And I won't embarrass, I hope, Michael too much by reminding him that he once wrote that almost all historians are tidy-minded. Well, maybe we are. But the problem about the Second World War, I think, is the extraordinary complexity of this conflict. And it does, I think, raise some potentially baffling issues for anybody who wants to write about it. Because it is really the history of everything over a period of 6 years, but a history which is absolutely packed with extraordinary drama. Now, I want to highlight, first of all, 3 of the issues that strike me as important about writing the history of the war. The first is the issue of timing. Now, some recent histories of the Second World War have begun on September the 1st, 1939, with no introduction or explanation, and end, of course, on August the 15th, 1945. Now, this is clearly not satisfactory, and indeed, the chronology has become increasingly moved forward and backwards for the Second World War to be able to make sense of everything that happened during the course of the conflict. Reluctant though some historians are, I think, to accept the idea of the 30 Years' War, it is difficult to get away from the idea that we are looking at a rather discrete period of European history and Asian history, 30 years, which is punctuated by periods of intense violence. And I think anybody writing the history of the Second World War has got to accept the extent to which it's rooted in the experience of the First World War, not least because many of the leaders and commanders, of course, in the Second World War had fought in the First World War, not just Hitler, Mussolini, but most of the leading commanders as well had experienced the First World War and brought that experience with them to the 1930s and the 1940s. It's also important to push it forward beyond 1945, because although 1945 seemed at the time a kind of curtain that you drew down with all the horrible things behind it, looking forward to a bright new global future, you can't draw that curtain down. A great deal of violence went on after 1945, and I'll come back to some of that in a moment. A great deal of violence went on after 1945. A great many unresolved issues in the war were only resolved, again with violence, over the course of the decade that follows. In other words, a strict chronology of 1939-1945, I would argue, doesn't work anymore. And in some sense, it's quite misleading if we focus simply on that 6-year period. Then there's the issue of space or area, if you like. Now, the war did touch the entire globe, as you will know. It touched it in all 3 dimensions, too: land, sea, and air. In fact, I was often puzzled when, as a child, I listened to my mother's stories about my family in the war. My mother was based in Sri Lanka. My uncle had a commission in Antigua in the Caribbean. My other uncle was serving in the Pay Corps in Egypt. And I remember being puzzled about a war that Britain was fighting against Germany in so many different parts of the globe. But it was global. People did find themselves fighting in tiny corners of the war, of the globe, whether in Madagascar or the Aleutian Islands or wherever. Even neutrals, of course, were touched by the experience of war, often rather dramatically. For example, the Spanish Legion that went off to fight on the Eastern Front, or in more surreptitious ways, Swiss bankers that were able to take gold melted down from murdered Jews and to put it into their vaults. But we tend to think, and I think you can see why, of course, of this as a European war in which the Asian war is in some sense a kind of appendix. One of the things I found in contemplating writing about the Second World War, of course, is that we now have an extraordinarily rich literature about the Middle East at war, about Southern Asia, about Eastern Asia, to make us realize, of course, that this was a war that affected all parts of the globe, but particularly the Middle East and Mediterranean, particularly South and East Asia. And indeed, it's impossible to write the history of the war without being able to write about these diverse theatres and political systems. Third is the problem, I think, of definition. Well, the definition is a Second World War, thanks, of course, to Churchill, whose volumes, I think, are visible on the shelf behind me. But, of course, it's many wars. Now, this was something that A.G.P. Taylor argued many years ago, of course, that you can't understand this simply as a war between Britain, France, and Germany, but there are many wars. But he was thinking largely of international conflict, of regular wars. I think one of the important changes in the historiography of recent years has been to recognize that there are very different kinds of wars going on. There's war from below, as well as, if you like, war from above. There's wars for liberation, as well as wars between states. And the work of people like Donny Gluckstein or Ernest Mandel has highlighted the extent to which, if we leave out this war from below, we are missing a very important dimension of the conflict. I think we can distinguish perhaps 3 different kinds of war going on over the period that I've described. Wars between states. And these are, of course, the major military conflicts, because only states can afford to wage war on that kind of scale. Wars between states, either as aggressors or as defenders. Then civil wars. Civil wars like the civil war in Ukraine, or in China, or in Italy, or in Greece, or even Spain, in fact, which can be integrated, I think, into our larger story. And these civil wars really about the future system. What is the future system going to be? And then there are what I call civilian wars. These are the wars of self-defense, and the one that strikes me most, perhaps, is the organization of civil defense against bombing. Again, is something which we always think of as happening during the Blitz, etc., etc. But civil defense was worldwide. Everywhere you had to prepare for the prospect of being bombed. And civil defense required an extraordinary self-defense effort on the part of the civilian community. I've calculated that by 1941-42, there are something like 30 million people in Europe enrolled in one form of civil defense or other. And then there's another kind of civilian war, which are wars of liberation. Now, these are wars of resistance, these are insurgencies, but they're not just insurgencies against the Axis occupiers, against the Japanese or the Germans. There are insurgencies, of course, and civil movements against the British or the French in their imperial possessions. The aim of these kind of civilian wars, of course, is liberation. Liberation from empire, liberation from occupation. Now, these three wars are not the same, though, of course, they do clearly overlap a great deal, or even converge. In Yugoslavia, for example, the partisans, the resistance, their efforts converge with the efforts of the regular war. Perhaps one good example is Italy. If you stop the clock at the moment, at the end of the war in northern Italy, you have an extraordinary mix of forces, an extraordinary mix of conflicts. There you've got the States' war between the Western Allies and the German occupiers. You've got the Civil War between fascist and non-fascist or anti-fascist Italians. You've got the civilian war trying to cope with the impact of bombing and trying, of course, to accelerate the liberation of the Italian people. There are plenty of other different groups around in northern Italy at the end of the war, which again suggests how confusing our history of the war is. I think perhaps of the Jewish Brigade, 5,000 soldiers who were recruited from Palestine. The British refused to allow them to fight, but finally did relent at the end under American pressure. And the Jewish Brigade ended up on the Italian front at the point of German surrender, but busily hoarding away weapons and equipment so that they could be shipped or smuggled somehow to Palestine, where they would help with the insurgency against the British, who they'd been fighting side by side with in Italy. Well, I won't bore you with more details about the Po Valley in 1945, but it's a good example, I think, of just how complex the various trajectories are which bring people together in the Second World War. Now, what I want to do, and I want you to indulge me in this, I'm afraid, what I want to do for the rest of my lecture, really, is to explain how I want to configure the war. And it does seem to me that what we need for the Second World War is a very broad historical framework, a contextualization to be able to make proper sense of the nature of the conflict and the reason the conflict broke out. Now, much of what I'm going to say is not, I think, particularly original.